Hey everyone, and welcome to the kickoff for season 5. Paul, good to see you again. It's been a while since wrap up for season 4, and actually for everybody involved, it's been a while since the very first episode of this show. And we've learned a lot. You've shared with us how much you've learned a lot, and we're all continuing to learn together. Number one thing that we want to address today and spend some time chewing on is something that perhaps was obvious to us, but not as obvious to people being aware of this show, perhaps inviting Paul in other conversations. The Pope Francis generation, there's a difference between being a fan club versus being a generation defined by a papacy. And some of us are for, some are against, and some are finding a middle line or learning how to not become a devotee of a person while they're still working out their own salvation in fear and trembling. Friends, welcome to the Pope Francis generation. It's the show for Catholics struggling with the church's teaching, who feel like they might not belong in the church anymore, and who still hunger for a God of love and goodness.
Your hosts are me, Paul Fahey, a professional catechist.
And I'm Dominic, someone who needs catechesis. Together, we're taking our own look at the Catholic Church, her teachings and practices from 3 views that changed our world.
And those are the kerygma, the doctrine of theosis, and the teachings of Pope Francis.
Together with you, we're the Pope Francis generation. And so there's a question. What does that actually mean to call ourselves the Pope Francis generation? So that's what we're going to get into. But first, it's been a few months.
It's
been a while.
It's been a long time. Dominic, what projects have you been up to? How have you been the past few months? Because we normally talk like every week or more when we're doing recordings.
And then it's just like dead zone, and we're both recuperating on sabbatical from everything. I've been messing around with Mike in the Where Peter Is debrief. So we've continued doing that for a little while. Over the Christmas period, kind of took some time off to reevaluate what I'm doing with Smart Catholics and rethink about that, and start trying to do new things, get a bit more focused. There have been some phenomenal people. I mean, they continue to join, these phenomenal people. But I'm trying to partner up with some people like what animated the same way that you are, with the same sorts of things about, trying to make a positive contribution to the church today, and trying to work with them so people might see some changes in the community. But it's been a good couple of months. A lot of reading, a lot of watching, a lot of turkey, if you make turkey over Christmas. How about you? What have you been up to?
Yeah, the past several months have been good. You just used the word sabbatical, and I hadn't thought of it that way. But I mean, it's not a sabbatical from work. I've been the fall semester was very busy with classes and with internship, and on top of classes, I've seen like 10 clients a week in internship, and that work has been fantastic. But it's felt like a sabbatical in, I don't know, I think I've experienced a lot of intentional personal growth in the past several months as well. A lot of self-reflection and looking at, I'm like graduating in May. So there's like, okay, I've been working 3 years for this degree. Now what? Like, there's a new life stage coming up, and that's provoking questions for me of like, so who do I want to be? What work do I want to do? What space do I want to be in the church and in the counseling world? And I feel like it's been a really fruitful few months, and hopefully have some positive things to share from that.
So I think out of a lot of this reflection has emerged this conversation, this episode. There have been a number of things that have happened in the church as well. We'll get into that. Some of it has been disconcerting, disillusioning. It's been a regular troll fest out there in terms of people deliberately making pig's breakfasts out of topics that half the time feel like, can we just move on to the next thing? Like, there's nothing to see here. And they're just absolutely turning it into a bonfire. And so then you've mentioned how that's led to some really serious reflection about the person of the Holy Father himself, and then what that means for this show. And there's some, legitimate difficulties, or however you want to say it. So let's get into some of that. What's as far as what's been going on in the church, you had some little notes here. You want to recap some of those?
Yeah, I mean, the past few months we had the first Rome meeting of the Synod on synodality. We've also had with Cardinal Fernandez being named the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. I think that dicastery's put out more teachings in the past 6 months than almost feels like the rest of Francis's pontificate combined. And and I've really appreciated those.
Yeah.
I see that as valuable, but those come with their own set of controversies. So I have guests lined up this season to talk about the synod, to talk about some of those teachings. So yeah, kind of looking forward. This is like a preview. Looking forward to the types of conversations coming up. We're going to be unpacking some of what the church has been doing the past few months.
Fantastic. So when we kicked off last season, we went back and so we explored the 3 pillars. Can you briefly recap those again and what those mean for those who are joining us for the first time, perhaps? So we have the kerygma, doctrine of theosis, which is so much fun, and the teaching of Pope Francis, which, I mean, all 3 of them are like in shaken, not stirred, dangerous stuff put together.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have in our intro kind of like, what's the point of this podcast? The point of this podcast is, like, I've lived my faith in a space of tension for several years, and wanting to create a space in the church for people who, like myself at different times, have struggled with the way church leaders have misused their power, the way that faith has been mixed with politics in a really negative way, where, like, I don't share those political beliefs. Do I still belong in the church? Yeah, just all of these different dynamics in the church, struggles with some of the church's teachings that make me feel like I don't belong in the church because I don't meet these criteria. And yet I'm still here, and I still find a home here and a space here. The goal of this podcast is to help by holding that space, by being genuine in that space, inviting other people into that. So, like, that's the goal. And the way we've done that is our 3 pillars. You just said that the kerygma, doctrine of theosis, and teachings of Pope Francis, those have been, as we talked about at the beginning of last season, really pivotal for me and what that space looks like.
Yeah, agreed.
So today it's kind of like stepping back and looking at another component of our identity, and our mission is the name of the podcast itself, the Pope Francis generation. What did that mean? I mean, I came up with that name at one point. What did it mean then? What does it mean now? And what space do you and I intend to continue to hold with this podcast?
Yeah. I've been doing almost the same thing with, like, Smart Catholics this past year, kind of wondering how, when I created it was intended to do one thing and intended to be one thing. And then 4 years later, we're now coming up on our 4-year anniversary. I'm beginning to wonder, is this still really a good idea? And if it is, then what do I need to be doing? Or how do we need to be getting along together to make it meet a name like that? Or does it need to be reimagined or something? And so it was interesting to have you then mention that you're in the same place, trying to figure out, is it time to maybe walk away from the name or reinvent this thing, or maybe hold the line, but help people understand where we're coming from a little better.
Yeah. There's several years ago, there's a podcast I listened to, Catching Foxes, a Catholic podcast, and one of the hosts on that said something like, "I don't trust anyone who works in the church who doesn't have an existential crisis every 6 months." And I think it's probably more than that. It's more often than that. So like, I don't know, Dominic, walk with me through my existential crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I came up with the name Pope Francis Generation just over 2 years ago when I first started my Substack, which predates the podcast by about 6 months or so. And it was a riff off of the JP2 generation, which is a phrase that most Catholics in the U.S. are probably familiar with, like people who were formed by the pontificate, lived through the pontificate of, or came of age during the pontificate of John Paul II, right?
Yeah.
That the way they see themselves as a Catholic is somehow associated with the person and teaching of John Paul II. And that's the generation of Catholics that I was primarily formed by, especially in high school and as a young adult in college. I was primarily formed by people who describe themselves as John Paul II generation Catholics. So I chose the name Pope Francis generation as a riff off of that, but really specifically from it's inspired, the name's inspired by Bishop Barron. He gave a talk in 2018. It was at the World Meeting of Families, I believe was in Ireland that year. And he was giving a talk, you can probably find it online still, about Amoris Laetitia, which had come out just 2 or 3 years before. And he has this line comparing to the John Paul II generation with the teachings of Pope Francis. And so Bishop Barron said this: I taught in seminary for many years. I love the John Paul II generation. A lot of the kids that I taught for many years were inspired by John Paul II. They came to the seminary because of his heroic ideal. And he's my hero. I've got a picture of John Paul in my chapel in California. Then he was in California, now he's in Minnesota. Barron continues. But if I can say this, the shadow side of the John Paul II generation of seminarians was they often got deeply frustrated when they fell short of the ideal. He continues, because John Paul II was such a heroic figure, and indeed he was. And he held out such a heroic ideal, and indeed he did. And they properly were called to follow it. But then what do you do when you fail? I think they struggled with that. And I read Francis as being sensitive to that fact, that part of our pastoral experience. What do we do when people fail? And Francis prefers the path of mercy and reinstatement than the path of exclusion. And I think that strikes me as right. And when I first heard this from Bishop Barron, I was like, that's it. That he was able to really articulate what about Francis's teaching was different than the spirituality I inherited from my formators, who were John Paul II Catholics.
Really briefly, I'm just curious because I don't know that I was necessarily formed by the John Paul II spirituality, so I may not be as clear on what all of that means. But I'm interested when you say he prefers the path of mercy and reinstatement to the path of exclusion. Was there an exclusionary mindset that just, I don't know, was part of that heroic approach to getting things done?
Yeah, I think we have to distinguish when talking about the John Paul II generation. Same as when we're talking about the Pope Francis generation.
Yeah.
Is like, I'm not talking about the person or teaching of John Paul II directly. I'm talking about my experience of the people who identify with him and were formed by him. There was
a general attitude in how they approached or how they lived out what he was saying.
Yeah. And there was definitely, like, I experienced in the spirituality from that generation, like the focus was on the heroism and the ideal. And there's very much there needs to be a place for that. But it was also mixed with like fear of anything less than, especially fear of those outside the church, fear of and maybe this comes from like this is the generation that came of age just after the sexual revolution, during the height of the Cold War. You see the fall of the Soviet Union, like the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, where there's this fear of the other, especially the secular world, and that's
it also was there was a mass awareness of the reality of ideological warfare. Maybe before academics knew about that, the specialists, the professionals knew about that, and the average person was just like, live for God and country, or king and country, or whatever. And then now we get the Cold War in the 70s and the 60s, and then the general populace being formed by the newspapers and getting more access to mass media. Now all of a sudden you're hearing these ideas of other sides, or whatever the names are, bad guys, and taking on or co-opting ideas, and I could understand there being an allergy to anything that seems like it's deviating. And
it's a faith that became, and it was shaped by a culture war, where there's this sense of like the outside culture, the secular culture, is bad, and they are our enemies, and we need to protect ourselves from it and also work to undermine it. But this caused, in my experience, a defensive faith, a
Right.
defensive spirituality, where like the church was seen as the safe place. Like
Hmm.
there's turmoil out there, all the ideologies, the sexual revolution. There's so much turmoil, but
Hmm.
here in the church we have these objective doctrines, these
Hmm.
morals and teachings that are unchanging.
Hmm.
Like we have this fortress of safety to
Yeah.
protect ourselves from the outside world. Um, but it like it turned the outside into like an abstracted culture, and we lost sight of like actual real life
Hmm.
persons.
Right.
And I think that's the like the the culture, like the threat of exclusion, I think came in there, like the focus on, well, these people represent, or we associate people with an ideological movement or a
Mhm.
culture, and that creates exclusionary practices for the individual.
Just in hearing that outlined, that if I'm that doesn't sound like something that is a recent thing. It sounds like something that's an old. I mean, that's just church has always been that way. The church has functioned that way. The hierarchy was structured in many ways that way. Cultures were formed and continue to be formed in that way. Maybe it seems like, especially under John Paul, we became more aware of that, and so there's a cognitive dissonance that arose because of that. Um,
I I think, and again, I'm not putting the blame on John Paul, but like my
yeah.
experience of like early 2000s apologetic movement, this type of thing in
Do
the
you feel it
culture,
got
where
worse, perhaps, or it exacerbated as opposed to before?
I think there was a mixing of
Hmm.
Catholicism with culture war in a way that evangelization became conflated with apologetics, but really it was about winning the culture war. Evangelization
Yeah,
was about convincing people to join my side of the culture
yeah.
war.
Like an integralism.
Yes, yes, but like a diet flavor, not the like the full-on integralism that wants to like reestablish a monarchy or something insane like that. But this idea of like, um, yes, but um, like an abstraction to culture instead of concrete
Mhm,
people. That
mhm,
evangelization became winning over the culture to get laws passed or policies changed instead of how do I bring Jesus Christ to another individual human person so they can experience his healing and his
mhm.
love and his grace. So with this, also part of this spirituality that I experienced was like the tendency towards the heroism and idealism that the Bishop Barron reflects on was
Mhm,
also a subtle turn, or this thread of Pelagianism, this
mhm,
idea that I need to make myself holy, that I
mhm.
need to live up this ideal at all time, and there wasn't any room for weakness, and that the primary actor really became me and not God.
Mhm.
Um, so this combination of like this objective, unchanging bulwark, this like pull up your bootstraps, Exodus 90, go and be holy. I mean, Exodus 90 is after John Paul, but like that type of mentality
Yeah.
um, left little room for those who who had weaknesses that they
Mhm,
couldn't just choose to overcome.
mhm.
People who are unable to live out the moral law, unable to live out the ideal,
Yeah.
and it created a tendency to fill out the pastoral gray areas with
Mhm.
just black and white answers. Oh, you're living this way. You're living in this relationship. You're
Yeah.
excluded. You're excluded from the sacraments because the way that you're living. Um, and I see this as a type of like I experience this and see it
Mhm.
as a type of fundamentalism, a
Yeah.
rigid
Well, that's
thinking of
you're
like,
describing how I grew up and all of the attitudes that we had growing up. So
yeah, this idea of like we this rigidity that's like we have the truth, we possess the truth, other people don't have the truth, other
mhm.
people are out to get us, we must protect ourselves from other people,
Yeah.
and also everyone in our group needs to like behave and believe the right way or you're excluded from our group. This is fundamentalism.
And even if when it gets it's like at the nicest end of the spectrum, it's always a very gentle condescension, um, as opposed to a a gentle accompanying. You know, there's such a difference of tone and attitude and approach between those two words.
There's a triumphalism.
Well, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
an
So,
arrogance.
yeah. So to reiterate,
Hmm.
I'm not saying this was coming from John Paul II himself, but I'm
Right.
saying this is how I experienced,
Hmm.
this is how I was formed by the Catholics who
Hmm.
identified with his
Yeah.
pontificate. In contrast, my experience of Pope Francis's teachings has been, as Bishop Barron said, a prioritization of God's mercy and love, and this idea of how can we include, how can we reinstate as much as possible. So Francis, he comes on the scene and he's like, we're not fighting the world outside is not our enemy that we're fighting a culture war against. He says, we are all brothers and sisters. That's Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all. And the church isn't fighting a battle against another side. The church is the field hospital
Hmm.
where we are here serving everyone. Like everyone's wrecked by sin and suffering.
Hmm.
And our job as Christians, as church, is to go out and bring Christ's healing and mercy to everyone. We have no enemies if we're a
Yeah.
field hospital. And I think this unsettled a
Hmm.
lot of people.
Right.
I found it compelling.
Hmm.
And then um, with that is the idea then we must meet people where they're at, not expect them to be different or be better in order for us to meet them. We
Hmm.
meet them where they're at. We bring the love of God to them where they're at. We let them know that they are wanted and desired by the Lord. And we demonstrate that by showing our own desire to be with them and to be for them. And then we accompany them step by step as the Lord progressively heals
Hmm.
and transforms them. This is my experience as a anti-fundamentalism.
Right. Right. There's like the ortho bros or the trad bros wanting a muscular religion, a muscular faith, um, very 300 years ago, very Middle Ages, knights and stuff like that. And I like your use of the, you know, we have to stop this concept of soldiers fighting a war. We have to use military terminology to define how we go about getting things done. Um, Pope Francis has been very much, like you said, about a field hospital, about medicine, about healing, about being a field medic. Right.
As
And
Christ is the great physician,
yeah,
primarily.
yeah, the a shepherd or a physician, and I've enjoyed the theme of a first responder, somebody who's not standing back and just filming the apocalypse on their iPhone, but somebody who just drops everything, drops whatever you were planning to do that day, and runs into a situation because there's nobody else doing anything and the person needs help, and somebody needs help, needs to be talked off a ledge. You just need to sit there and be with them. Um, Especially because the church today and Catholics, Christians today, people of faith, do not hold a place in the culture where we are seen as uh, obvious figures of authority, or that we have a message that demands respect or authority or attention.
Yeah.
And I
And
think it's becoming so important that we need to lose that perspective or that cultural hope, which is how we used to operate.
yeah, in a post-Christendom
Mhm.
Western
Yeah.
culture, it was C.S. Lewis who said something like this. He was comparing evangelization in the first centuries versus
Mhm.
of the church versus evangelization now. And he's like, in the first centuries, we were like the church was trying to court and woo and win over like a new lover,
Yeah.
and now we're trying to win over like a divorcee
Mm.
who left because we abused them in the first place. Like a
Oof, what a way to put it. Yeah.
post Christendom world,
Hmm.
like we have no room as Christians for triumphalism because
Yeah.
we abused our power so horribly at
Hmm.
times. Um, did Christianity do a lot of good things? Yes, absolutely. But uh, we abused our authority
Hmm.
and still do. So yeah, like what credibility do we think we have as Christians to feel like we are owed the attention or the platform within
Hmm.
secular culture?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, So I've been thinking, like the past couple of months, there's been an image that comes to mind to like sum up, like what's the heart of what Francis is proposing, and I think that Francis prioritizes
Hmm.
belonging.
Right.
So when a person knows that they are loved and wanted by God and have a place in God's family, that God's family wants them, it's in the safety and security of knowing that they belong that a person is best able to grow into having right beliefs and right behavior.
Hmm.
But right beliefs and right behavior, in my assessment of Francis, is that those are not prerequisites to belonging. Belonging comes first. And I see many strains in the church, sometimes explicitly, sometimes unspoken, have a discomfort with wanting people to belong if they don't already believe the right thing or behave
Yeah.
the right way. And I don't
Right.
think Francis has that discomfort.
Right.
I think he's like, no, everyone belongs. Everyone has a place here. Everyone's wanted here.
Yeah.
Um, now, belonging is different. Belonging doesn't necessarily mean everyone uh, meets the criteria for being fully sacramentally received. Belonging doesn't mean everyone has a right to have a position of authority
Hmm.
within the church, but it means everyone has a place.
Right.
And I think I see, I perceive Francis's mode of operation
Hmm.
is that he looks at, okay, what's essential.
Hmm.
So you look at the recent document from the DDF, which we'll talk about more later in the season, of blessing same-sex couples and couples in irregular unions.
Hmm.
So in that, I see Francis saying, like, okay, what is essential? What can't we change? Well, we can't change our understanding of marriage. We can't change our understanding of the human person. We can't change our understanding what God has revealed to us about sexuality, right? We can't change those things. Those are essential.
Hmm.
Okay, so then our choice is, if that's the big red line, do we build up frameworks so that we protect that line as much as possible? Or do we try to accommodate people as much as we can without crossing that line? And I think his perspective is, no, we accommodate. We remove as many barriers as we can
Hmm.
without crossing what's essential,
Hmm.
um, in order to help people feel like they belong. Um,
I
go
think
ahead.
of something like, yeah, like founding myths is such a important, well, not just important, it's how we operate. So for example, the founding myth of Rome is Romulus and Remus, and they're building the walls, and one brother insults the other brother, like, look at this ridiculous wall, it's like, you're not going to get anywhere with it. And then the other brother kills him right then and there. And the founding myth is of Rome, nobody makes fun of Rome, nobody ridicules the Romans, something like that. And so you raise your children in that idea, you raise your military and your culture, and like, nobody ridicules us, you know. That's a pretty powerful message to be raised in. Well, the Holy Father is like, I love his return to the parable of the shepherd and the lost sheep. And you can do the same with the shepherd and the Samaritan. But what I love about the shepherd with the lost sheep is you get so many people today who are like, you know, look at us, the faithful ones. Why aren't you taking care of us? Why aren't you paying attention to us? Look at all of this time you're effectively wasting on those who don't actually care about what you're putting on the table. And the beauty of that parable is Christ not going like, gotta follow the greater good here, and take care of the 99. It's my job to effectively make sure the 100 or the 99 are secure. The majority have to make it home at the end of the day. And he does the most ridiculously dangerous thing. He assumes that you guys need to keep it together for like 5 minutes while I go and try and find the one that, doesn't
Yeah,
deserve to fall off the edge of a cliff or something.
yeah. The founding myth is, I like that you point to that parable, is that for God, He's telling us one person is too many lost,
Yeah.
and 99
Imagine
is
raising,
too few.
yeah. It's, I mean, that right there, that comes back to theosis, and a lot of some of the most popular conversations that we've had on the channel, like with Jordan Daniel Wood, really are anchored in what happens when you take that parable really seriously all the way to the end. What does that do for how you raise children, how you interpret catechesis, how you just go about trying to be a good human being,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, what does, because in that parable, it says that the shepherd seeks the sheep until he finds it. Like there's a
There's not a I'm
there's
doing my best.
yeah, there's a
And
persistence. And
yeah.
so okay, so speaking of founding myths, like one of the very first things I read from Francis was the name of God is mercy, and I mentioned that several times on this podcast. And there's like, and I think it's just a myth. I think it's just a story that's told in that book, in that interview with Francis, and but it shaped me and how I understood how Francis understands God, right? So the story in the book is there's a soldier. He's going off to war the next day, so he goes to his chaplain that evening to go to confession, and he's like, "Father, I slept with this woman and this other woman and this other woman, right?" And the priest is like, "Well, are you sorry you did that?" The guy's like, "No, I'd probably do it again, actually." And then the priest says, "Are you sorry that you're not sorry?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm not sorry." And the priest is like, "That's enough. I can give you absolution." This idea of like the nature of God is to find any crack that he can, because he is persistent until he finds it, right?
Mhm.
So then what is the disposition that we ought to have as the church? Is to be seeking until we find, to find excuses to welcome people in instead of putting up barriers. Again, not compromising what's essential, not compromising what's true and what's good,
Mhm.
but still doing everything we can to pursue and accommodate. Uh, that's the paradigm shift
Mhm.
that I see with Francis. Not that that didn't exist. I mean, John Paul II talked about mercy all the time. Like that's there, but
Mhm.
it's Francis's prioritizing of it that I
The
think
application. Yeah.
is the difference.
Yeah.
So when I named my Substack and this podcast, Pope Francis Generation, this like anti-fundamentalist church, um, that's what I've had in mind, right? That use this podcast to hold a space within the church for people who don't feel entirely all in with the church, who feel
Mhm.
like the Lord still needs to pursue them in some way because they don't feel like they belong entirely.
And I think there's a lot of, I think I can say us, there's a lot of us who look at what does it mean to be a Catholic? And you go online, you see all the YouTube channels and you see the people showing up at your parish, and you're like, wow, all of these celebrity Catholics and all of these, uh, the ones who seem to have their cards punched right, they end up feeling fundamentalist, or they end up saying things in ways that lead to all the stuff the Holy Father is decrying. Um, and I think for a lot of us, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel not even right. It doesn't feel desirable. And like you say, we're stuck. We know we want God. Maybe we feel like there is nowhere else to go because who else has the words of eternal life? We kind of feel like we're in that place, but there's nobody able to allow us to have a period of wrestling, either where we recognize we need to change, or perhaps we bring something that our local culture or the church culture uh, has to develop or has to evolve.
It, and that, to be clear here, and I think this is important,
Mm-hmm.
at least it's been important for me, is like, it's not like, oh, I became enlightened by Pope Francis and now like I get it. But this call to like anti-fundamentalism,
Mm-hmm.
like that call is always present. So like for myself, just in the past several weeks, I've reflected on, oh man, I still have fundamentalist attitudes. Now they're directed at different groups now. Now it's like I don't want those traditionalists because look at the harmful fundamentalist things that they're saying about God and about the church.
Yeah.
But the church wants them too. God
Mm-hmm.
wants them too.
Yeah.
And am I taking the effort to like really hear what they have to say and be like, I wonder why they're saying this? Like, do I have a disposition of curiosity and compassion towards their side? Or am I just reacting with, I don't want you here. I don't want you to belong.
Yeah.
When they're being pursued by God, as much as any other group, as much as any other person is being pursued, um, this anti-fundamentalist spirituality, like I think is and thankfully is persistently challenging. It's not like you get it and then you're fine. It's like, no, this is something we need to always be examining ourselves for.
Right, right. It's that typical danger of fighting fire with fire, or um, being careful to, how do you say it again? It's like you end up becoming that which that which you fight, or that which you hate, because you end up employing the same tactics, the same mental patterns, same way that they go about things. We end up doing exactly the same thing for the good, and of course we assure ourselves that we've now got it right, and we end up being exactly like those we say are them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So then, okay, so that's where the name came from. But
and then what it continues to
be, yes.
yeah, and what it means for us. But at the same time, we're now holding it in, how would you say, space of mature attention, because this is not, like you say, following him, reading his documents, all of a sudden we're enlightened because he's such an enlightened, delightful person. You've mentioned how, well, like you said, every 6 months you have an existential crisis and you get disillusioned over a new headline. And you've mentioned that you've had some of that disillusion. So let's chat about that.
Yeah, I think that there's been more intentionality. So, like, my experience of Pope Francis in the past 6 months or so has been one with a lot of disillusion, where so in the past year or two especially, I feel like the Lord has moved my heart and opened me up to hearing people's stories in a way I haven't been able to hear before, to where I feel not just more capable of prioritizing people who have been harmed in the church, but that I believe that is the space. I believe that's the space where the Lord is leading me, both within a ministry sphere and within a professional counseling sphere, is prioritizing people who've been harmed in and by the church. So that framework has really shaped the way that I see the church. That's tremendously shaped that. But then when I brought that lens and focused that lens on Francis over the past 6 months or so, I've not enjoyed what I've seen. So on one hand, I think Francis's teachings have done real good in combating the abuse and manipulation of power within the church.
Mm-hmm.
So things like the emphasis on synodality, which I understand to be more co-responsibility in co-power, like co-leadership between ordained and lay people in the church.
Mm-hmm.
At least in theory, that seems like a really important structural reform to helping combat abuse. Francis's teaching on the infinite dignity of every human person and universal fraternity, and prioritizing the most vulnerable. This is obviously really essential in combating the abuse of power within the church.
Mm-hmm.
His teachings about sin and culpability have corrected areas where the church, where I saw and participated in the church's teaching being misused and misunderstood in a way to spiritually abuse people.
Mm-hmm.
And then Francis's like regular criticism of clericalism and like clergy misusing their power, the abuse of spiritual power, the abuse of conscience, and how that's all interrelated to the clerical sexual abuse crisis. Like all of that's connected, this abuse of power. Like Francis teaches and talks about all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important. But on the other hand, I see when I look at Francis's decisions and his choices, he doesn't seem, in my mind, to be living up to his own teaching. I think that's the source of my several months of disillusionment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Keep going, because I know you've got a couple of examples that speak to that highlight that.
Yeah, I think the two biggest examples, and these are not the only examples, but the two that kind of like I think shook off my rose-colored glasses. One is the way that Pope Francis has handled the case of Father Rupnik. And we talked with Colleen Dully about that back in the summer, and there's been
It
more
just seems
news.
like it's continued to get worse over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some good decisions, but it seems like the good decisions have come only after like public outcry and public pressure, which doesn't really point to the character of leadership when they only do the right thing when like their feet are held to the fire. And then also, like, as much as I love what the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, what the teaching they've put out in the past several months,
Mm-hmm.
Cardinal Fernandez is, I mean, when he started in his position this summer, there were like, he did not handle abuse cases in his own diocese particularly well. And when Francis appointed him, he's like, because the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith deals with doctrinal issues, and it deals with governing and sanctioning clergy who are accused of abuse. So they have kind of that penal role as well. And when Francis appointed Fernandez, he's like, you're not going to be involved with that penal role. You're just going to be involved with doctrine. And I'm like, okay, but can we prioritize? Like, I was 12 years old when the Boston Globe first broke the news about the abuse scandal in the church. And my whole life has been, my whole formation in the church as a young adult and adult has been under the shadow of not just that priests abused kids, but then
Mm-hmm.
the systemic cover-up that is still ongoing
Yeah.
of priests abusing kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, this feels like one of the most important things. So when there's major governing decisions happening in Rome, and this doesn't seem to be like one of the most important things on the table,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for me to see the Pope and those decision makers as prioritizing the marginalized and the vulnerable, those who have been abused and those who are most vulnerable to abuse. It doesn't seem like that's being taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Thoughts, Dominic? I'm starting to rant.
No, I don't really have much to add. I mean, I've seen some of the headlines. I've kind of followed things from mostly where Peter is, and I think for me that I've put the Holy Father in a different, where I've how do I say this? I've learned to put him in a different role in my spiritual life than what he had been, than the space he had been filling. And so now when I see this stuff happening, I am regretful and sad that that's just how it is. But it's just reminded me he's what a human being he is under pressures I can't imagine, advised by people I have no idea who. Um, and it's how unfair it is to also expect someone to be a living saint, but at the same time, kind of like as you've pointed out, he's been adamant about certain paths of behavior, certain ways to get things done, and we're not seeing it happen. So
Yeah.
I'm not able to speak more specifically just because I don't remember the headlines as clearly as well as you do, and I deliberately try not to because some of it can get quite depressing.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
keep going. Like you've got. Uh, Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, this isn't new.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying this to excuse Francis' decisions in any way.
Mm-hmm.
But like, even going back to Peter,
Mm-hmm.
when we have the story in the New Testament of where St. Paul talks about how, I confronted Peter to his face, that was because at the Council of Jerusalem, the big question was,
Mm-hmm.
can Gentiles, can non-Jewish Christians become Christians and not have to follow the Mosaic laws,
Yeah.
in particular circumcision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Council of Jerusalem, presided over by Peter, says, no, Gentile Christians don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, Peter goes and doesn't, he's in a situation where he doesn't socialize with the Gentiles, right? His behavior goes against what he actually taught.
Yeah.
And that's what St. Paul was calling him out on, how his
Mm-hmm.
behavior did not match what he taught.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes back to the very first Pope, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to, I mean, we see this in John Paul II, who is a saint,
Mm-hmm.
and the profound blind spots that he had with people like Father Maciel running the Legionnaires, his elevation of Cardinal McCarrick, where it was like it seemed John Paul II was not prioritizing like the dignity of people being abused. He was going along with the system. So like, but the thing is, like, those are in the past. We know better now, but these seem to still be going on. Like Francis isn't doing these things in the past. He's doing these things currently.
Yeah.
And there's less of an excuse to do these things currently, right? That's what feels particularly scandalous for me.
Right.
It's like, you know better because you've taught it. Why are you still practicing this way? Why are you still going along with this culture and this systemic sin of abuse of spiritual power in the church? Yeah. So that's caused me then, kind of stepping back a little bit, in the past several months, to re-examine. So my experience of the faith in the past 6-8 years has been, one thread of that experience has been one spiritual leader, one priest, one apologist, one theologian after another who helped form me, who I respected. I read their books. I went to their talks. I listened to their whatever, right? And then coming out and being like, either saying things that aren't true or saying things that are harmful in such a blatant way that it's like, I'm probably never going to recommend that book to anyone else again. There's been so many instances of that. And then there's the like extreme examples, the like Jean Vignes, who ran L'Arche. And then after he died, it was like, no, look at the ways that he systemically abused, not systemically, the way that he consistently abused his power to abuse vulnerable people under his care for years. And he was held up as a living saint. Like, I have become very aware over the past several years of the dangers of being a devotee of any spiritual leader who's alive. Yeah. Now I've had to like face that and do self-examination of, okay, but have I done that with Pope Francis? Have I become a devotee of the person and not just someone who's trying to really take seriously his teaching? Because in Catholic theology, those things are distinct. The person and behavior of the Pope, that like the Pope's governing decisions, are not guided and protected by the Holy Spirit. His teaching is. So like, how do I not become just a Pope Francis fanboy, but how do I still like embrace and take his teaching seriously?
Yeah, that's agreed. So where are you ending up then? How have you resolved that?
I haven't.
That's the whole point of the show.
Yeah. So like, okay. So if it weren't the Pope, and I've done this with clients who have people in their life who are like, this person's kind of abusive and narcissistic, where it's like, okay, at some point, like, it's totally reasonable and right and loving to put the person at a distance, sometimes to cut them out entirely if it's not safe, right? Yeah. You can forgive a person and still be like, I can't have you in my life because of how harmful you are. Now, if this person is, a political leader or a spiritual leader, like, we can do that too. We can be like, I'm going to stop passing this book on to other people. I'm going to stop passing out like Jean Vignes books to people because of the things that he did. Right. Like, and I think that there's times when, like, continuing to promote a public figure, after this type of behavior has come to light, it seems like, I feel like there's a moral obligation. I have felt a moral obligation in some sense to not promote them because of these things, in part because what does that communicate to people? What does that communicate to people who've been harmed? Right? That like, oh, the good this person did outweighed the harm they caused. Certainly don't want to communicate that. Right. But it feels different with the Pope because personally, I've experienced him as a spiritual father, and I've found his teachings transformative. I also more objectively see his teachings as being what's necessary for the church to be more healthy,
Mm-hmm.
moving forward, and less fundamentalist and more like undermining of this abuse of power within the church, but also because he's the Pope. Like, he's the vicar of Christ. He's the
Mm-hmm.
successor of Peter. He's the pastor of the church. Um, and everything he teaches on faith and morals, uh, even the things that aren't infallible, are still in some way guided and protected by the Holy Spirit and require my assent. And not in a like, I don't think magisterial teaching requires my assent in a like half-hearted, I'll tolerate it kind of way, but in a way where it's like, no, through this person's teaching, the Holy Spirit is moving the church forward, and I need to be on board with that and not just tolerate it. So how do I disassociate in some way from the problematic behavior of the Pope? Well, still, like, how do I hold all these things as true at the same time? um,
Yeah.
and I find myself just living in that tension.
Yeah.
That's where I found myself. There is no resolution. There is just
Mm-hmm.
holding this bundle of things that feel at some points contradictory to each other, and kind of holding them all together because I
Yeah.
believe all of them are true.
Especially when it's happening right now, when it's the news cycles right now, and it's teaching plus Twitter at the same time, and I would assume that if we were to go back in time at any point dealing with anybody, like I'm sure there are some people who hated Saint Jerome's guts because he didn't make it easy for a lot of people.
He also had a temper. He
Yeah, that's
probably
what I
had a
mean.
lot of people who didn't like him.
Yeah, but at the same time, he had some incredibly valuable contributions to make, and so I'm sure there are people at that time who had to hold some really harsh things in tension or whatever. So I don't. It's not a new thing. Um, this is one major reason why I value creating a show like this, creating a space with you like this, because there are plenty of things that I uh, feel I don't need to address or think about because it doesn't affect me immediately, or I just haven't had a conversation with somebody that brings it up. But to see people like you who are such a front line, such a field medic to a lot of people, um, and seeing the conversations that you have, seeing how where Peter is going about things, and the other members of the team. Um, yeah, there isn't an easy answer, and I think anybody who says there is one probably hasn't thought hard enough or hasn't wrestled with it deeply enough, because there is a cognitive dissonance. You do have to hold two things that feel like they do not fit together. And for me, I'm trying to not perhaps, but I'm trying to focus on abstracting his teachings from what he does, and try and pay attention to those and not, how do I say, be troubled or worried about what he gets up to or what the politics of the moment happen. Because 100 years from now, his teachings are probably still going to hold, and they're still going to matter because they're a contribution to what the church is and how we need to act. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to figure out, if this is what he teaches, then who do I need to be? And there's a point at which it doesn't matter what he gets up to or what happens, because in 50 years we won't remember it. Um, but we will have not enshrined the teachings, but we will have uh, learned how to elevate the teachings beyond what he does.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it matters to some extent in.
well, in terms of credible witness, and that's where I say there's a point at which, because yes, we still need. This is when we now live, and we have to answer to it or for it to
Yeah,
others.
yeah, yeah, the credible witness for sure, and then also the Christ prioritizes the vulnerable and the marginalized,
Mhm.
and he puts them at the center of his kingdom. And um like, that's, to me, like, so fundamental. So when we have decisions that are being made where it certainly does not appear like the most vulnerable and marginalized are holding the center, are being prioritized, um there's a sense of like, how do I want to put this? There's a priest on Twitter who's actually in my diocese, Father Joe Krupp, and he had a tweet from many years ago, and he said, talking about confusion and stuff in the church or whatever. He's like, how do we know who to follow? And he's like, you follow the poor, because that's where Christ said he was. And I think there's a real sense of like, we need to prioritize the voices of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And what are they saying? So
Mm-hmm.
when their experience of Pope Francis is, this is someone who I don't think I can trust because he doesn't seem to be prioritizing people who are vulnerable to abuse in the church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, there's something important there.
Yep. Yeah.
That's a voice that ought to be heard more than it's being heard now.
Yep. I agree.
So I think that like going back to what's it mean to be a part of the Pope Francis generation?
Mm-hmm.
I think it means being more anti-fundamentalist. I think it means working for reform in the church to tear down the sinful structures of abusive power within the church. I think it also means having to where the previous generation, where the John Paul II generation, like he's a saint, he's a canonized saint, and there was the sense of like John Paul II can do no wrong. That's certainly the perspective of John Paul II that I received from the people who formed me in my faith. Maybe on paper they'd say, yeah, whatever, but like, it was like, no, this is someone who can do no wrong. This man's a saint. Of like this putting the Pope on the pedestal that we did for John Paul II. And maybe my generation, your generation, and the younger, the ones who don't know a church pre-clerical abuse scandal, that maybe putting popes and bishops on pedestals isn't what we ought to be doing. And how do we like love and embrace a teaching and also criticize the harmful actions of a person, of a pope? How do we do that? And I think that's something that's defining this generation in the church, perhaps more than previous generations.
I like how you put that. And that point about paying attention to the poor, as we wrap up, my final thought that it's kind of emerged as of the last couple of months, which is I have a hard time believing the truth from somebody whose job is on the line. And so, like you say, people in positions of power, or basically anybody where there's a job performance or what they say is not just controlled by, but is conditioned by the position of authority or the position that they have to play. I have a hard time trusting that. But when I see somebody who's prepared to dispense with everything, like Christ himself, even to the point of their own life, because they can't get around or away from a message that is absolutely convicting to them, then I can begin to trust that person, because I trust they actually believe what they say. And I've met so many people where I look at their lives and I'm like, I don't think you believe what you're telling me to believe, And there are moments where I look at Pope Francis' life and I think you do. I think you do believe, because there are moments where you do things that seem like career suicide or political or personal suicide or something, for the sake of the truth. And then there's other moments where he doesn't. And I'm not interested in explaining to other people why. It's just how it is. But there's that credible witness, again, like you're saying.
Yeah. I think that explaining why, that's something we're going to get into. A future guest is we're going to have on to talk about institutional vice or structures of sin, and this to talk about some of that. How is it that human beings, you and I, the Pope, are capable of like having beliefs and values in our personal life and then acting differently within different groups of people? How does that moral dichotomy even happen? So yeah, that is something that I hope to talk about going forward.
Yeah, well, friends, look, if a conversation like this resonates with you and you feel like as Paul's put it, he's in a space of terrible tension or a space of irreconcilable, truths or points of view on these things that you can't get around,
You're
First of all,
welcome here.
you're welcome here. We won't say, come on in, the water's fine, but we will say, we believe we found the waters of, eternal life. Where else can we go? But it's a mess in here, and we need everybody on deck to help try to create this credible witness. And it takes everybody being as real and authentic and genuine with how they're going about it. The difficulty with a lot of fundamentalism, and I mean, I feel I can say that growing up as a radical traditionalist, with a lot of fundamentalism, is you'll say things you don't believe because you feel this is what keeps
You ought to
in.
say.
You ought to say, yeah. So if the community that we're building sounds like you, please hit like on the video. It's going to help more people discover the work that we're up to. Leave a positive review on Apple, or hey, leave a genuine review. Why should I say leave a positive review? So that more people can discover the show. Paul, if friends do have a question or they want to leave some feedback, perhaps send it directly to you on the show, where can they go?
Yeah, you can visit me anytime at or message me at popefrancisgeneration.com. And if you choose to become a paid subscriber there, you get early access to each podcast episode. And your support directly supports my family and allows me to continue to do this podcast and other projects like this.
That's right. These are passion projects that Paul works on. And then same with Smart Catholics. You can come join Paul and myself in Smart Catholics. It's this online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations that are unafraid of doubts and questions. It's my personal project, Smart Catholics. We're trying to build the cutting edge of Catholic social teaching. And a show like this is a contribution to that. Also for education and spirituality. So we're free of trolls and ads and toxicity. That's always been a fun one people have really enjoyed. So come and check us out at smartcatholics.com. Till next time, say a short prayer for yourself and for us. And remember, don't be afraid to ask questions. Doubts can be a sign we want to know God better and more deeply. God bless you.